It is I, Rtyuiope from Rtyuiope's Game Room, once again with another Year of Megami Tensei video. We're reaching the last stretch of this video series, and I'd like to end it with a look back at many of the different eras of the Shin Megami Tensei series. One which has evolved plenty across the years, taking on a great number of different incarnations. Now, of course, I won't be focusing on anything but the mainline franchise, which includes those games which have the Shin Megami Tensei title, not including Digital Devil Saga, which only has the name in America, like many other titles localized at the time. The first episode will be focusing on the rebirth of the Shin Megami Tensei franchise and its first few influential years. Yes, I'm talking about the first 3 Shin Megami Tensei games released for the Super Famicom, Shin Megami Tensei, and its sequel and its pseudo-spin-off Shin Megami Tensei If. It is important to note that these are the first few Shin Megami Tensei games where Atlus had full creative control of the franchise, being cited even today as sources of inspirations for the games that followed it. In a way, we could say this is the franchise's infancy, where it acquired its most defining traits and built on its pre-existing foundation to solidify the identity of one of our most beloved series. Bearing fruit to the identity of the franchise was Shin Megami Tensei, released for the Super Famicom by Atlus in the year 1992, and was later given ports for the PC Engine, Sega CD, PlayStation, Game Boy Advance, and Android and iOS. And even your goddamn calculator, it seems, because this game was pretty much ported to anything imaginable. Well, for Japan at least. Us Americans only got the iOS version. This game was made as a reboot to the pre-existing Digital Devil Story Megami Tensei franchise, which was also developed by Atlus, however it was published by Namco. Shin Megami Tensei was Atlus's first big project after being contracted by companies like Telenet, LJN, and Namco. So the game was their first passion project in which they put everything they had into it. This was the role-playing game they wanted to make. The game was produced by Hideyuki Yokoyama, directed by Yusuke Nino, programmed by Koji Okada, written by Ryotaro Ito and Kazunari Suzuki, and had Kazuma Kaneko as the art director for the game. Despite what it seems, however, Koji had a lot more involvement in the game than just a programmer, as he was one of the lead creative directors of the game. Initially, Atlus saw Shin Megami Tensei as a remake of Megami Tensei 2, since the two had the most in common, using its story as a template while also adding to it. One of the major additions was the Law and Chaos heroes, which served as the protagonist's friends until the inevitable split that happens once they pick an ideology to side with. One of their key thoughts during development was to separate themselves from what was popular in the industry at the time, making SMT nothing like games like Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest. The concept of Shin Megami Tensei took a while to be completed, having many story drafts edited and added upon by various development team members. At one point, the game was supposed to be a globe-trotting adventure where the ending would take the heroes to Israel, but it was decided by the team to keep it more local and have the game take place in Tokyo, Japan because of the limited budget of the team as well as the limitations of the hardware. Their main inspiration for telling a demonic post-apocalyptic adventure came from the mixture of mangas such as Devilman, Violence Jack, and Fist of the North Star. Once the game was released, it was met with great success, being met with favorable reviews such as from Famitsu, being one of the 11 games to receive a positive score of 36 out of 40 or above until 1992. Also being one of the highest rated games of 1992, even competing with the juggernaut Dragon Quest V. The game received positive sales as well and helped establish Atlus as a developer and a publisher. What about the game though? Well, I've played it, so let's talk about it. The game's introduction is very odd, starting the player off inside of a dream where the protagonist encounters several formless characters who he must name. It's an odd intro that really helps establish the kind of tone the game is going for, as well as foreshadowing the themes of the story. Once the dream is over, the player wakes up in his apartment in the quiet subsidiary of Tokyo, Kichijoji, where he lives with his mother and dog Pascal. Surprisingly enough, the opening of the game is pretty mundane, as the player is only tasked with simple chores such as finding coffee for his mom, yet things soon take a turn for the worse. Demonic sightings become more and more frequent in his hometown, leading to a full demonic invasion. The gameplay is rather up to par for RPGs of its age, being a first-person dungeon crawler with turn-based combat. Outside of dungeons, however, the player explores the overworld of the game, which is just Tokyo, as a cute little blue arrow avatar guy, which is supposed to represent the player, something that is carried over to the other games of the franchise. While the game still uses elemental affinities and magic, they only do critical damage, meaning that the system is far more basic than it is later on in the franchise. It's definitely a slower game than what we're used to in later SMT games, but that doesn't make it a bad game. In fact, disregarding the future games and getting used to this game's more dated aspects can actually be really fun and kind of addicting. While new players may be put off by the constant random encounters, franchise veterans will be able to get used to them pretty easy, which works in favor of us because it removes the pressure of grinding for boss encounters. Well, it's not a perfect system, as the game is not balanced properly for players who want to explore an area to its fullest, making the random encounters needlessly hard while the bosses become mechanically easy. Each time the player levels up, they obtain experience points, which they can use to level up certain stats, which can help you learn and master your abilities. This is definitely one of the most engaging and unique aspects of SMT, which was unseen from popular games at the time with their more simple leveling mechanics. You can easily get involved in building your character with a great variety of stats. Well, sort of. You see, the protagonist is unable to learn magic, which means that leveling up the magic stat is pretty much useless, meaning that you can level up magic on your heroine to compensate. He's also the only one allowed to converse with demons, which means that leveling takes a priority among other stats, essentially just leaving you with a couple of possible character builds. Shin Megami Tensei also introduces magnetite, a reoccurring currency in the franchise which is consumed whenever the player summons a demon, has a demon in their party, and in some cases it's required for fusion. More importantly than that, the game introduces demon negotiations, however without as much depth as in later installments. Almost every encounter is based on luck, if not stats, but if you can get a negotiation to go right, you can end up with a nice chunk of change, some magnetite, and maybe even a new demon companion. Also worth mentioning is the soundtrack composed by Tsukasa Masuko, which is definitely some of the best that the Super Famicom has to offer. It's very foreboding and ominous, but also chaotic and energetic. It's a combination of orchestral samples with rock music and is very prevalent in the game and fits the theme perfectly. So perfect in fact that it's established a precedent for the entire franchise, which would follow a similar tone for its compositions, even with different composers. The first part of the story revolves around the protagonist and the people who he meets in his dreams, getting tied up in a huge conspiracy to start the apocalypse from two opposing factions in Tokyo, accumulating in a nuclear apocalypse called forth by the United States ambassador, the not-so-subtly named Thor Man. Narrowly avoiding the blast, our players are teleported to the Diamond Realm by the game's heroine to keep you safe from the city as it's destroyed. Once the characters reawaken, they find themselves in crumbling remains of Tokyo where you fight the demons who have overrun the land. Your friends eventually find their own callings, one of chaos and one of law, and you are left to decide. Will you fight with the army of God to create a millennium-long kingdom of Tokyo that lives under his law, or will you fight along Lucifer to make a world where only the strong are capable to live? Or will you take a third option, one where you throw everything you hold dear in the name of balance? Many may not realize it, but Shin Megami Tensei is actually very unique in this regard, as it's one of the first video games that approach multiple endings in this manner, presenting a unique philosophy and ideology to go along with the player's decision, which is separated from the usual good ending, bad ending structure that most games are used to. It goes away from many of the preconceived notions that players have about being a heroic character in a role-playing game and presents something truly unique. Something that stood out for being bolder than the rest and presenting a world with no definitions of good and evil, only ideology. While the game was very positively received, the team at Atlus was anything but pleased with the final product, remarking that the Law and Chaos heroes were too emotional and unsympathetic, or that the fusion system was too complex for it to be accessible to players. This self-critique was only a point of improvement though, as the team started to work on the game's sequel right away. Shin Megami Tensei 2 was released in 1994 and was developed as a direct sequel of sorts to the first game. Unlike the first game, however, Shin Megami Tensei 2 did not receive so many releases, only being available on the Super Famicom, PlayStation, Game Boy Advance, Android, and iOS, with no planned release in America up to this day, which makes Rtyuiope a sad boy. However, of course, the game still remains playable thanks to translation efforts by Aeon Genesis, which allowed Western players to play this game in English. The game only follows the plot of the first game loosely, of course as it takes place in the same world as the first game, however many years in the future where the characters and events of the original are no longer all that relevant to the story. However, this is the Megami Tensei franchise we're talking about, so of course there's a lot of continuity, so of course I would consider them direct sequels. This time, the director of the game was Koji Okada and Kaneko back as the game's art director. Masuko came back to do the score and Ito back to write the story. One interesting trivia I could find about the development of the game is that shortly after development of the first game, one of the team members got robbed, and the other team members saw it as a direct consequence of making such an occult game, so they visited Masakato's grave to cleanse themselves, potentially of malevolent spirits. The developers originally did not intend this game to be a direct connection of the first, so newcomers wouldn't have to play the original in order to understand the story. However, Kaneko decided that the game should take place in the same continuity. Kaneko actually got in a bit of a disagreement with the writer on exactly how far in the future this game takes place after the first one, but they both decided on setting it a few decades after. I feel like one of the most underrated aspects of this game is actually its soundtrack. The music in this game is definitely more experimental than the last in order to fit the more science fiction setting. SMT2 uses more synthetic sounds and almost completely moves away from rock and moves into disco? Yeah, disco baby. Goofy, furious dancing aside, the songs in the game are actually more mysterious and calm than the previous game. The songs that I think are worth mentioning are the game's battle theme, law theme, overworld theme, disco theme, and many others, of course. It's definitely a different sound, but it's still an achievement. Once you give the music an honest chance and listen to the whole thing, there's definitely some gems to be found. Soundtrack aside, the gameplay is more or less the same, maintaining the core structure of a 2D overworld, 3D dungeons, both sprinkled in with random encounters from demons who you can negotiate with, all with minor changes and improvements, such as the ability to encounter multiple types of demons on the field. Demon Fusion was given improvements, though it mostly remains the same. The biggest improvements come in terms of presentation and graphics, which give the game environments which are more detailed than in the previous games, as well as the user interface that's more accessible and detailed than the last one. The balance of the game is also greatly improved, keeping things more balanced for both players and enemies throughout. The story centers around Hawk, a lower-class citizen of Valhalla with amnesia who fights in the Colosseum in order to obtain a citizenship for the Tokyo Millennium, humanity's refuge after the destruction of the Basilica and the second apocalypse that takes place after the end of the first game. Tokyo Millennium was made in the site of the Basilica by the Law faction, who took over Tokyo after the SMT1 hero managed to set balance to the world. After winning the tournament in the Colosseum, they find out the Hawk is actually the Messiah awaited by the people of the Tokyo Millennium, Aleph. He is then partnered with Beth, who is destined to be his companion for an eternity. Along his journey he encounters Daleth, who opposes him and declares himself as the true Messiah, not knowing that he's actually the anti-Messiah, who is prophesied to oppose Aleph. Along the course of his journey, however, Aleph realizes that things aren't as they appear to be, and it is revealed to him that he's actually a fake Messiah, created artificially by the four archangels, as the real Messiah was yet to show himself to the world. It is also revealed that all of Aleph's partners and friends were also creations of the archangels, meant to fulfill the archetypes of the Messiah prophecy. As a result of this revelation, Aleph starts a rebellion against the archangels and soon finds himself fighting God himself in order to establish a new institution of either benevolent law, revolutionary chaos, or independent neutrality. No matter what path you really take, you still must face Yahweh, and Aleph eventually defeats him, however being unable to kill him. After all, humans cannot live without something to rely on or cling on to, which means that humans will eventually go back to praising God and giving him new life. Because of this, Yahweh curses him, which results in him having to face eternal reincarnation to walk the earth through countless apocalypses. Their use of the Judeo-Christian God was a very bold and unprecedented move, and Kaneko stated that the only reason why they chose him as the important figure of the game was because Kaneko viewed God as what all other gods were based off of, a genesis of all mythological figures. His appearance in the game was based off of the way he's presented in the Old Testament, which contributes to the game's interpretation of the Messiah story and the creation of the New Testament. Despite being the antagonist of the game, Kaneko makes it very clear that God wasn't the source of all evil, but rather having a conflict of interest with humanity which requires them to go head-to-head, further contributing to the themes of the game. What is more interesting is that Yahweh would not actually make an appearance in any of the later games in the franchise up until Shin Megami Tensei 4 Final/Apocalypse, which we will discuss later. After the release of SMT2, the team behind the franchise decided to make a third installment. This third installment, however, would not be a sequel, but a spin-off of sorts that dealt with a small-scale conflict instead of a large one, opposite of the aforementioned two games. Released that same year as SMT2, Shin Megami Tensei If saw the light of day on the Super Famicom and was later ported to the PlayStation, iOS, and Android, and surprisingly enough, even to PC. I couldn't, however, find any footage of the PC version, so I'm not really sure whether it even exists. The game was made mostly by the same team as SMT2, but most importantly, it was the first game that Katsura Hoshino, future director of Nocturne and the later Persona games, worked on as a designer, coming up with the game's signature Guardian system. It was actually developed within a very short period of time, less than a year, which the developers thought was unthinkable that it could be done. If is a sort of spin-off to the franchise, as the team wanted to set an apocalypse inside a small-scale location, eventually opting for the game's setting to be in a high school, which is actually based off of Ito's high school, which they used a modeling base using his yearbook photos. The game was initially titled Shin Megami Tensei X, but was later renamed to If based off of the movie of the same name, in which a private high school faces a revolution. The game diverges from the main franchise with its two main mechanics, the partner system and the guardian system. The former system is in which one of the players can choose one of the three human partners to accompany them throughout the game, while the latter system grants the player a guardian spirit where each time they die, it brings them back to their last save, and grants them a special stat bonus or penalty depending on the rank of the guardian. The soundtrack of If is not very noteworthy as it's comprised mostly of remixes of the first two games, however, it is the first Shin Megami Tensei game to feature a song with lyrics. Well, another thing to mention is the game's battle themes, Old Enemy, which is a reoccurring song across the franchise from Nocturne and even Persona 5 if you buy the DLC of course. The game, just like its predecessors, took many inspirations from manga, such as the character of the game Akira, who is named after the main character of Devilman, or the antagonist Hazama, who is named after the main character of Blackjack. The game received mostly mixed receptions, being mostly talked about for its music, story, as well as its setting, which was so popular in fact that Atlus decided to bring it back when developing the next project, Megami Ibanroku Persona. However, the game was criticized for its dated graphics as well as its inaccessibility to players. Fans of the franchise also thought that the game was lacking because of the simplicity in terms of religious and philosophical aspects, which made the previous game stand out. The story itself revolves around a genius high school student named Hazama, who was constantly bullied in school and decided to take revenge upon his peers by turning into the occult. Gee, I wonder where I heard that one before. Anyway, he unleashes a portal to the Expanse, which creates a mini-apocalypse within the school's walls. The main character, whose gender can actually be chosen by the player, and their group of friends have to save the school, and by extension, the world, from Hazama's threat. Not really much can be said about the game right now, since it hasn't received a release or a fan translation in English to this day. What we do know, however, is that the game is sort of a what-if scenario to the original one, where the conflict between Godo and Thorman are averted before it escalates into a nuclear apocalypse, meaning that the events of the first Shin Megami Tensei game cannot transpire. This is the only mainline game to not be translated other than SMT9, which means that we can't really talk about much of it past this point. Which is disappointing really, because this game is actually far more important than it leads on to be, as it's the main inspiration for the Persona franchise. So much so, in fact, that it's even part of the same continuity. All of that aside though, these are the most important games in the mainline franchise up until this era, and we can all notice that they share a common trend of setting up or inspiring elements that would soon become important to the franchise. There is more to attribute to these games, and that's why if you're a fan of SMT, I recommend that you play through them. SMT2 especially. Please, play SMT2, guys. This is not me speaking. This is Howard talking, my editor. He really wants you guys to play it. You do not have to narrate this part. Don't do it. Quit reading this part. Stop. Anyway, as they are still very unique and very interesting games to play, even to this day. With all that out of the way, our journey through this era of Shin Megami Tensei has come to an end. After this era, we're going to see the franchise's peak with titles that most people hold in high regard. Of course, I'm talking about the era of the franchise spanning from Shin Megami Tensei 9 all the way through Strange Journey. It is definitely an interesting era, and I'm really excited to cover it. So, until next time, I'll see you soon. This is Rtyuiope from Rtyuiope's Game Room, signing out.